The B-24 came in so low that the tops of the corn and the telegraph wires seemed to rise toward its belly. Heat shimmered off the fields, and ahead the horizon turned black, not with clouds, but with smoke-thick, oily smoke that swallowed the sun and made midday look like an eclipse. The bombardier could barely see the refinery shapes until they were almost on top of them. Metal towers, skeletal pipes, storage tanks the size of houses, and flames already licking upward where earlier waves had hit. Then the air around the Liberator began to crack and snap. Tracers stitched past the cockpit like sparks from a welder. A burst of light flared off the nose as a shell struck somewhere forward. The aircraft shuddered, and in the greenhouse nose the bombardier felt the sickening moment where the whole machine seemed to pause, still flying, still alive, but suddenly fragile, as if the air itself had turned solid. Below them, anti-aircraft guns fired from rooftops, from rail yards, from hidden pits along canals, from places no training map had ever shown. There were balloons in the smoke, cable lines you could not see until they were almost in your face. There were trains that were not trains at all, but gun platforms waiting on sidings like traps. And somewhere in that blackness, the refinery's Heart Germany's fuel was still pumping. The lead pilot held his line anyway, because if he pulled up now, the bombs would fall wide. And all of this, months of planning, weeks of rehearsal, the long flight over the sea, would die in a mistake measured in seconds. He had practiced this run over a fake oil field in the desert until he could do it with his eyes closed. Over Romania, with the world on fire, he discovered what practice could never teach. The real target fought back. It was the morning of August 1st, 1943, and the place was Ploiești, Romania, Europe's oil refinery capital, the Axis fuel reservoir, the lifeline that kept aircraft in the air and panzers moving. The attackers were American heavy bombers, B-24 Liberators, launched from North Africa in a mission the planners believed could cripple German war power with one brutal blow. It was not a story about sleek fighters dueling in clean sky. It was a story about industrial war, about fuel, pipes, and pressure, and the men asked to fly a four-engine bomber like a low-level assault aircraft, straight into a defended factory complex, where every gunner on the ground knew exactly where they had to come from. The promise was simple and terrible. Hit the oil, and the war changed. Miss it, and the price would be written in lives. Months earlier, the oil had already become an obsession. Germany could build tanks and aircraft, could train crews and manufacture ammunition. But without fuel, everything else became metal waiting to be abandoned. Ploiești was not just another target on a map. It was a system. Refineries, storage farms, pumping stations, rail spurs, repair crews, and a defense network built like a fortress around the machinery. The Allies had struck at Ploiești before with small raids, and they had learned the first lesson. A refinery could be hurt, but it could also be repaired. To truly break it, a raid needed weight, accuracy, and surprise. That combination became an idea, then a plan, then an order. The plan demanded something almost unnatural from a heavy bomber force. Instead of high altitude, where contrails and flak bursts formed a deadly geometry, the bombers would go in low so low that bombs could be placed into specific units, cracking distillation towers, rupturing cracking units, and setting storage tanks alight. Surprise would come from altitude, or rather, the lack of it. At low level, the theory went, radar warning would be reduced, and high-altitude gun batteries would be less effective. The Liberators would appear like a storm breaking over the fields and vanish before a coordinated defense could gather itself. It sounded elegant on paper, It sounded less elegant when crews began practicing what it meant. In the Libyan desert, engineers and planners built something that looked like a mirage, a replica oil field, a fake Ploiești, laid out with markers and mock structures so that bombardiers could rehearse the run-in and the timing again and again. Crews flew over it until their throats were raw from oxygen masks and their brains felt carved into grooves by routine. They learned what a refinery looked like at 200 feet and 400 miles an hour. They learned how to identify a tower line, a tank farm, a rail spur. They learned where the bombs should go and how little time there would be to correct once the target appeared. They learned to fly the big Liberators at low altitude in formation, a discipline that demanded constant attention. Slight changes of throttle, tiny corrections on the yoke, the uneasy feeling of mass and momentum that never left the cockpit. In that desert, there was no smoke, no cables, no panicked civilians, no flak trains. The fake oil field did not shoot back. It did not burn. It did not change shape mid-run and vanish under a black ceiling of fire. The Liberator itself was a paradox for the task. The B-24 had range, and it could carry a heavy load far, which was why it was chosen. But at low level, a heavy bomber's strengths became vulnerabilities. It was large, it presented a thick profile, and it relied on altitude for survival more than armor. The crews knew the aircraft intimately. The roar of 4 engines, the vibration through the airframe, the long wings that seemed to flex as if the machine breathed. They knew the defensive guns, the turrets and waist positions, and they also knew the dreadful truth. At low level, ground fire arrived from everywhere at once, and no turret could cover every angle. The mission was asking men to take a strategic bomber into a tactical killing zone, and to do it together, in daylight, and to do it precisely. On the day of the raid, the Liberators rose in waves from North African fields, heavy with fuel and bombs. The takeoff runs were tense and long because a fully loaded B-24 had no generosity in its margins. Once airborne, the formation gathered, turned north, and crossed the Mediterranean. For hours, there was only engine noise, sea glare, and the careful mathematics of fuel and time. As they approached land, the bombers dropped lower, settling into the kind of flight that makes the stomach tighten. Terrain close beneath, the horizon wide, no room for error. The crews checked weapons, oxygen, intercom. Some men looked at photographs of their families tucked into pockets. Others stared forward and tried to make their minds quiet. There would be no friendly fighters overhead. The distance was too great, and the route too complex. Whatever happened over Romania, they would face it alone. By the time they reached the Balkans, the mission was already beginning to fray at the edges. Low-level navigation was brutally unforgiving. Cities looked different from the air than they did on maps, and smoke from earlier strikes and industrial haze could turn landmarks into ghosts. The plan depended on timing and on a clean approach toward the initial point, the moment when the force would split and run toward assigned targets, like a hand opening into fingers. A single wrong turn at low level could drag hundreds of aircraft miles off track, and every mile moved the raid closer to defense zones meant for entirely different angles of attack. There was a moment brief, almost invisible in real time, when the shape of the flight path bent wrong, when a led group misread what it saw below, and other groups, trusting the leaders and the logic of formation, followed. In war, catastrophe often begins as a minor disagreement between a map and a landscape. Over Romania, it became a chain reaction. When the refinery region finally appeared, it did not feel like a target. It felt like a city. Ploiești was surrounded by rail lines, canals, industrial suburbs, and farmland. The refineries lay like separate fortresses, each with its own perimeter, its own smokestacks, its own defenders. As the first bombs fell, the place began to transform. Fires started in tank farms, spreading like liquid monsters across the ground. Black smoke rose and spread, thick enough to hide entire units. The bombers that arrived later flew into a target that was no longer the target they had rehearsed. It was an evolving battlefield, and it was alive. At low altitude, the defenses were immediate and personal. Machine guns and light cannon fired upward from rooftops and hidden emplacements. Heavier guns reached out from prepared sites, and some batteries seemed to have rehearsed their own timing, waiting until a bomber committed to its run before firing. Tracers were not distant streaks. They were lines that ended at the aircraft. Crews heard rounds tearing metal, felt impacts like fists. Waist gunners watched bullets walk across the wings. The smell of cordite mixed with oil fumes and smoke that seeped into the aircraft through holes no one had seen made. And still the bombers came on because the only way to escape was first to pass through. One formation bore down on a refinery complex and met a wall of fire so dense it looked like daylight had been replaced with sparks. The pilot held the Liberator steady while the bombardier fought to see through smoke and glare. At the last seconds, the aircraft began to take hits that sounded different, heavier, deeper, the kind that meant structure was being compromised. A fuel line ruptured somewhere, and the smell of gasoline flooded the cockpit. The co-pilot glanced at the gauges and saw pressure failing. The engineer shouted a warning. The bombardier called the release anyway. The bombs left the bay, and for a fraction of a moment, the aircraft felt lighter, as if it could climb away. Then another burst struck, and the Liberator lurched, bleeding speed and control. The pilot tried to lift, but the sky was full of smoke and cables, and the aircraft had become a wounded animal trying to leap a fence. Another crew, led by a commander who had already been hit before reaching the target, refused to peel away. The formation was breaking, aircraft scattering, some already on fire, some losing engines. Logic said to turn back, to preserve what remained. But the commander kept the nose pointed toward the refinery because he understood what the mission was truly buying. It was buying time. Every minute the refineries burned, every day the pumping and refining halted, cost the Axis something that could not be replaced fast enough in the middle of a global war. He pushed through the fire and brought his bomber over the aim point. Witnesses later spoke of a Liberator that seemed almost entirely on fire and still flying straight, still refusing to fall until the bombs were gone. The aircraft did not come back. Its crew's names would be spoken afterward, with the heavy silence reserved for men who did something impossible and paid for it in full. In a different part of the complex, another group attacked through smoke so thick the bombardiers had to use glimpses, fractions of a second when wind parted the black curtain to identify towers and tanks. The lead aircraft took brutal hits and still held formation. Men in the waist position saw ground rushing by at frightening speed, details of buildings clear enough to see windows. When bombs struck, they did not create neat explosions. They created industrial catastrophe, pipes rupturing, pressure and flame roaring upward, storage tanks collapsing, oil spilling and burning across the ground like a new river. For defenders on the ground, it felt less like being bombed from the sky and more like being attacked by a machine that had chosen to descend into their world. The defenders were not passive victims. Romanian and German anti-aircraft units had spent months preparing for precisely this. Ploiești's importance meant defenses were layered, disciplined, and inventive guns positioned to cover likely approach routes, smoke generators to obscure aim points, and mobile elements that could shift as attacks developed. Fighters scrambled when they could, diving onto damaged stragglers and picking at the edges of the formation like predators. But the deadliest enemy for the Liberators that day was still the ground itself, because at low altitude, every rifle, every cannon, every improvised gun position could participate. The bombers had traded the high-altitude shell bursts for 1,000 small killers. They learned the price of that trade on the run. Not every story ended over the target. Some Liberators limped away with one engine, then two, trailing smoke and losing altitude over the countryside. Crewmen threw out guns and equipment to lighten the aircraft. Men applied pressure to wounds and tried not to look at the holes in the fuselage that revealed sky where there should have been metal. Over the sea, damaged bombers ran out of fuel and ditched, their crews climbing into rafts under a sun that did not care which side they fought for. Others diverted to neutral territory and were interned, safe from death, but not from the strange limbo of captivity, without a recognized enemy. Some crashed in remote valleys where local partisans found survivors. Some vanished with no witness at all, swallowed by distance and fire. When the surviving aircraft returned to North Africa, the debriefings were grim. Maps were marked with losses. Crews spoke in short, tired sentences. The planners had imagined a clean, decisive strike, refineries burning, production halted, Germany's machinery starving. The reality was mixed. The raid inflicted heavy damage and caused dramatic fires, and for moments the complex looked like the end of a world. But refineries were resilient in a way that surprised those who had never watched industrial repair under wartime pressure. Units could be bypassed, equipment could be cannibalized, temporary solutions could restore partial output faster than outsiders expected. The raid had cut deep, but it had not severed the lifeline in one blow. The cost, however, was undeniable. Dozens of B-24s did not return. Hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire crews disappeared into smoke at the moment they had trained for most. And yet the raid also forced a strategic truth into sharper focus. The oil had to be attacked, not once, but repeatedly, until repair crews ran out of parts, out of time, out of safety. The fake oil field in the desert had taught crews how to recognize towers and tank farms. Ploiești taught the war how refineries truly died, slowly, under sustained pressure, with the attackers paying dearly for every hour the pumps were silent. In the months and years that followed, the oil campaign intensified. New bases in Italy brought targets within reach more consistently. Escort fighters began to cover stretches of the route. Attacks became less a single dramatic raid and more a grinding series of blows aimed not just at spectacular explosions, but at bottlenecks, cracking units, power supplies, repair facilities, rail lines, storage. The war moved, as it always did, toward industrial attrition. The raid of August 1943 became both warning and blueprint, a demonstration of courage and a lesson in limits. The men who flew that day carried a private knowledge afterward. They had seen what Germany's lifeline looked like up close, not as a dot on a map, but as pipes and towers and men on rooftops firing upward. They had seen oil burn in quantities that seemed impossible, turning the air into something you could taste. They had learned that rehearsals, no matter how meticulous, could only prepare the body, not the soul. The fake oil field had been a classroom. Ploiești had been an examination written in fire. And still, the idea that drove them there remained true. Fuel decided what armies could do tomorrow. A tank without gasoline was a bunker. A fighter without fuel was a museum piece. An empire without oil was an empire that had begun to die. On August 1st, 1943, the liberators of Operation Tidal Wave reached out across a continent to strike at that reality. They did not end the war that day. They did something harsher and more honest. They showed what it would cost to strangle a modern war machine at its throat, and they paid the first installment with their own lives.